She stood in formation, spine stiff as bamboo, uniform threadbare but neatly pressed. The sun beat down over the open plain, and behind her dozens of other Japanese women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, stood in absolute silence. They waited, as they had been trained, for punishment. Orders, a command, anything. But what came instead was the soft creak of a wooden screen door and the smell of something so impossibly sweet it made her knees falter. An American stepped onto the porch. He wore no helmet, only a cowboy hat tilted back. In his hands, a tray of cornbread, golden and steaming. Behind him, others followed, grinning sheepishly, offering plates like peace treaties. The women stared. This wasn't interrogation, this wasn't vengeance, it was hospitality, warmth, a gesture that shattered their every belief. They didn't move. They didn't speak, until the first one stepped forward, took a piece, and whispered, "Is this for us?" The war had ended, but something far stranger had begun. The others watched her hand tremble as she lifted the cornbread to her mouth. The breeze carried the scent of it, warm, sweet, thick with butter. Her eyes fluttered shut, and when she bit down, her shoulders sagged, not with fear, but with something stranger, release. The spell broke, and then another woman stepped forward, then another. A cautious line formed in the Texas dust, silent and bewildered, as the prisoners approached the Americans with eyes that could not meet theirs. They had arrived just hours earlier, herded off a transport truck like cattle, the engine still coughing as the women were ordered to disembark. The heat hit first, dry, unrelenting, not like Okinawa's humidity, but a sharp stillness that settled in the throat. Dust clung to everything. It turned their dark uniforms pale, their lashes gritty. A few coughed. Most said nothing. A guard shouted, "Line up!" and they obeyed before the translator even repeated it. They didn't need language. Military posture was universal. The camp wasn't what they'd imagined. There were fences, yes, and watchtowers, but no snarling dogs, no screams. The barracks stood neatly arranged beneath the wide Texas sky, their tin roofs glinting in the sun. And then there were the guards, not in the hard helmets and tight jackets they expected, but in cowboy hats and rolled-up sleeves, boots dusty from more than marching. One even leaned lazily against a wooden post, a blade of grass hanging from his mouth. He grinned when they looked at him, like they were a curiosity, like this wasn't war. The contradiction burned. They had been told to expect brutality. American soldiers were said to be mercenaries, crude, lustful men who killed for sport and laughed over the bodies. Yet here stood a man who chewed tobacco and tipped his hat. Another offered them water, not from a rusty tin, but a real canteen, cool and wet, and passed with both hands. It was disorienting. One woman, a radio technician from Nagasaki, whispered in disbelief, "They don't look like devils." But they still waited, for commands, for cruelty, for something that would confirm what they had always believed. Instead came the cornbread. The tray appeared with almost comic gentleness, balanced between two soldiers, both grinning like guilty children. They didn't push it at the women. They just stood, holding it out, the yellow squares gleaming with butter. One had a red bandana tied loosely at his throat. The other scratched the back of his neck like he wasn't sure this was allowed. "Ma'am," one of them said with an accent thick as molasses, "it's still warm." The translator stammered, uncertain how to convey this. It didn't matter. The smell did the talking. The prisoners froze. Some stepped back. A few squinted, searching for the catch. Poison? A trick? Surely nothing this kind came without consequence. One even clutched her side, remembering the beatings she'd seen in the final days of surrender. Another shook her head slowly, whispering that food given freely was a lie. But hunger does not speak in politics. The women had not eaten a real meal in days, perhaps longer. Their rations had run out somewhere between transport and surrender. One woman had shared her last dried plum with a nurse who could barely stand. That same nurse now stood frozen before the tray, the smell curling into her nostrils like incense. Her knees wobbled, and then she took it. That first piece, the taste stunned her. Sweetness, real sugar. Not rice syrup, not dried beans mashed into paste. Butter soaked into the golden crumb and melted on her tongue. She chewed slowly, then quicker, then looked up, eyes wide, mouth full, and gave a nod so faint it was barely a breath. It was permission. The line grew. The cowboys didn't smile anymore. They just handed over the slices one by one like communion. And something began to unravel, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet way that deep beliefs crack. Not under force, but under gentleness. They were being fed, not punished, not mocked, fed. And the thing that broke them first was not soap, nor song, nor steel. It was cornbread. But even as the sweetness lingered on their tongues, something deeper pulled taut inside them, an instinct honed by drills, oaths, and shame. The cornbread had entered their mouths, but not yet their minds. These women, auxiliaries of the Imperial Japanese Army, had sworn silent vows long before they ever boarded the ships that carried them into enemy hands. Obedience had been the spine of their training. Surrender, they were told, was a fate worse than death. And yet now, with bellies warm from enemy bread, they did not feel dead. They felt confused. Back in Okinawa, during the last gasps of the Empire, the training camps were filled with sharp commands and iron discipline. Most of them were girls barely out of school, conscripted as clerks, telephone operators, nurses, and message couriers. In sand-floored halls, they knelt before portraits of the emperor and recited the code of Bushido with clenched fists, death before disgrace, pain before disobedience, the emperor's will before your own. It was not metaphor. It was a lifeline, drilled into them until the thought of capture produced nausea. One nurse had watched a fellow recruit slapped so hard she bled for failing to bow correctly to an officer. Another remembered practicing mock interrogations where they were told to bite their tongues rather than speak. "If they take you alive," their instructor warned, "they will humiliate your family. You will live, but your name will die." They believed it, every one of them. So, when the bombs fell and the surrender came, sudden, absolute, and unbearable, something inside them shattered, but even shattered, they remained upright. They burned their uniforms, they folded their documents into rivers, and then they waited to be taken. The moment of surrender felt like the pause between heartbeats. They were gathered in a field behind the last field hospital on Okinawa. The sky was flat with smoke. One by one, they removed their caps, their eyes fixed to the earth. When the American jeep rolled in, they did not look up. They expected kicks. Orders barked in foreign tongues. Perhaps worse. One woman whispered a prayer not for rescue, but for the strength to die quickly. Instead, the Americans lowered their weapons. One offered a blanket. They were too numb to understand it. The journey to the United States was a blur of iron hulls and salted wind. The ship's hold reeked of oil and seaweed, and the women curled in corners like shadows. Meals were served, real food, even rice, even meat, but they chewed without tasting. It felt like a mistake, One woman wept silently over a boiled egg, her tears scalding her cheeks more than the shell burned her fingers. And when they finally stepped onto American soil, hot, flat, dry, the discipline remained. They stood in lines, they bowed when spoken to, they answered questions with as few words as possible. Their minds repeated, obey, survive, endure. But endurance only made sense in the face of suffering. And here, where suffering never arrived, their rigidity became absurd. The guards did not hit them. They didn't leer. They didn't shout. The cowboys just waved casually, offered biscuits, pointed them to clean barracks, and mumbled pleasantries. The more casually they were treated, the more alien it all became. Even their silence felt foreign in this strange new order. A few whispered to each other at night, terrified someone might be listening. But no one came, no punishment arrived, and still they waited for the cruelty their commanders had promised, for the violation their mothers had feared, for the degradation their training had warned would come. But it didn't. There was only dust and sunlight, and sometimes at the right hour the smell of sweet cornbread baking in the mess hall again. It filled the air like a challenge, a soft, warm question that none of them knew how to answer yet. Who were they now, if pain was no longer the proof of loyalty? The question lingered like heat in their skin, but they did not yet know how to ask it, so they chewed in silence. Each bite of cornbread, soft and warm, pulled something loose from their minds, not fully, not yet, but enough to make the world tilt ever so slightly. A few clutched their pieces like sacred relics. Others stared down at theirs, untouched, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. One woman pressed her nose to it, sniffing not for flavor, but for deception. It smelled like something a mother might bake. That terrified her more than poison ever could. The reactions varied. One nurse, a girl barely 20, with a face still shaped like a schoolgirl's, took a bite, then immediately turned away. Her shoulders began to shake. She tried to hide it, but the sob escaped anyway. Another woman reached for her, but the girl stepped back, eyes wild. "They want something," she muttered. "They want something." Her lips quivered. The others didn't know whether to believe her or comfort her. No one had ever been taught how to accept kindness from an enemy. Nearby, one of the American guards scratched the back of his head. He looked more like a ranch hand than a soldier, sunburned, lanky, with dust caked on his boots. "Dang," he said under his breath, watching the scene unfold. "Didn't think cornbread would cause this much trouble." His buddy beside him chuckled, but it was nervous, awkward. They hadn't been told what to expect from Japanese POWs, especially women. They thought they'd be tough. They thought they'd be angry. They hadn't expected silence, or the haunted looks, or the way these girls flinched when offered sugar. The cultural dissonance cracked like glass beneath bare feet. These women had been raised to see Americans as monsters, greedy, violent, godless. Yet here were young men offering food with calloused hands and warm smiles, as if none of them had ever fought each other at all. It didn't make sense. One of the older women, a radio operator with sharp eyes and a voice that once barked orders in the bunkers, stood apart, arms folded. She hadn't taken the cornbread. Her gaze swept the camp like a hawk's. "It's too soft here," she said finally. "It's a theater, a trick." But her voice lacked certainty. Even for her, doubt was creeping in. The destabilization wasn't loud. It came in small waves, a tremble in the fingers, a softened jawline. A glance held a second too long at the guard pouring iced tea under the shade. One woman looked up at the sky and realized, with a start, that it was beautiful, blue, wide, endless. She hadn't noticed the sky in months. What did it mean that she could now? At night, they whispered in the barracks, their voices raw. "Why give us cornbread?" someone asked. "What do they want?" Another replied. "Maybe they just bake. Maybe they just feed people." Silence followed. No one believed it. Not really. But they also couldn't deny the evidence in their bellies. That's what made it dangerous. The food did more than nourish. It cracked the logic of war. No soldier screamed at them. No one spat. They were not being punished. They were being hosted. The next morning, when the bell rang for mess, the line formed a little faster. No one said anything. But more hands reached for the tray this time. The cornbread was warm again. It smelled even sweeter than before. And the woman who hadn't eaten yesterday? She took 2 pieces. She didn't smile, not yet, but she held both slices of cornbread close, like they were something rare, something alive. The other women noticed. No one said a word. But the shift had begun, not just in her, but in the way they looked at the guards, the way they moved through the days. Something old was starting to loosen. It wasn't just the food, it was the men behind it. They weren't what the women expected, not the monsters painted in training pamphlets or whispered about in bunkers. These Americans wore hats that curled at the edges and boots that scuffed like they'd spent more time on dirt roads than battlefields. They leaned against porch posts and chewed toothpicks. One even played harmonica in the late afternoon, the sound lazy and strange, drifting across the camp like something from a story. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He was someone's son. A rancher, a man who used to ride fences and mend gates and string barbed wire for cattle, not prisoners. One afternoon, while the women were returning from a work detail, one of these cowboys tipped his hat to a young POW as she passed. He didn't leer, he didn't speak. He just nodded, slow and respectful, as if she were an equal. The girl froze mid-step. Her eyes widened like he'd slapped her, not with violence, but with something harder to name. Recognition. She kept walking, but her heart wouldn't settle for hours. Later that week, another guard, a quiet one with sandy hair and a stitched leather belt, knelt by the fence line, picked a wildflower growing near the ditch, and tucked it into a cup. At roll call, he offered it to a woman with calloused hands and a hollow look. He didn't say why. He just handed it to her, and she accepted it with fingers that trembled as if touching something sacred. The flower wilted within a day, but she kept the stem wrapped in a torn scrap of cloth, hidden beneath her pillow. These gestures weren't big. They weren't part of any policy, but they unsettled the women more than commands ever had. They were not used to being seen. In Imperial Japan, they had been functionaries, parts, interchangeable and replaceable. Even their names had sometimes been reduced to numbers. Here, the enemy nodded when he passed them. Sometimes he said, "Ma'am." Sometimes he held the water pail longer so they could drink twice. One even hummed while he worked, and when a woman dropped her bucket, he stooped to help without a word. It confused them, deeply. These were not men who should be helping. One woman confessed, during evening washing, "I feel more visible here than I ever did in the army." Another snapped, "Don't say that." But even she couldn't ignore the way her own chest softened when a guard held open a door. The conflict sharpened. Was this all a strategy, a trap, or was this real? Some women began to write about it, scribbled thoughts hidden in the margins of paper. Not full sentences, just fragments. He looked me in the eye today. He didn't shout. I forgot to hate him for a moment. The days passed slowly, but the silence between them began to shift. It was no longer just fear, it was uncertainty, Because what if kindness wasn't just a tactic? What if it meant something? What if the cowboy behind the fence was more than just a uniform? What if the enemy could still be human? The question didn't leave them. It clung to their skin like dust in the Texas wind. And then one day, without warning, the guards called them in. Not for punishment, not for interrogation, but for something else. Something none of them were prepared for. A shower. They were led in groups of 4 into a low wooden structure at the edge of the compound. No barking orders, no batons, just a calm voice and a gesture to go inside. The women hesitated, eyes scanning the door, expecting a trick. One whispered that maybe it was delousing. Another warned it might be humiliation. But then the door opened and steam curled outward like incense from a shrine. The scent of soap followed. Real soap, floral and thick, not the bitter gray cakes they remembered from their barracks back home. Inside, sunlight filtered through a high window. Pooling in golden patches on the tile, the waters streamed from pipes without rust, clean and hot. Towels, stacked neatly on a bench, waited for hands that didn't dare reach for them. The nurse, the same one who had once stitched bullet wounds in a field hospital beneath falling ash, stepped forward. She had not cried in weeks, not even when a comrade died whispering about home. But when a guard handed her a towel, clean and soft, and folded like a gift, something cracked. She crumpled to her knees. Her sobs were not loud. They were strangled, guttural, as though her body had forgotten how to make that sound. The other women turned away, not from disgust, but to give her something rarer than pity. Privacy. They knew what she was mourning. It wasn't just the war. It was the shock of being treated like she mattered. Beside the showers stood a table with small bottles, shampoo, lotion, even combs. One woman reached out, touched a bottle with trembling fingers, and then quickly drew her hand back. It felt too luxurious, too American. Another woman picked up a mirror, the first she had seen in over a year, and gasped at the stranger staring back. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked, her eyes ringed with shadow. But beneath it all, there was still something familiar. She touched her reflection as if to confirm she had not vanished. The showers themselves were surreal. Warmth cascaded over their shoulders, down their backs, over skin that had known only cold and salt and blood. Dirt ran in rivulets toward the drain, but it felt like more than that was leaving their bodies, something invisible, something heavy. For some, it was their first moment of solitude since capture. For others, it was the first time in years they had felt clean without fear of punishment. No one spoke inside the shower room. The sound of water echoed like music, broken only by the soft pat of bare feet on tile. When they stepped out, wrapped in towels that smelled faintly of cotton and starch, they looked at one another differently, not with suspicion, but with recognition. One woman whispered, "I feel human again." She said it in Japanese, almost afraid the walls might hear. But no one laughed. That night, the barracks were quiet in a new way. The usual shifting and coughing gave way to stillness. Some women ran their fingers through their damp hair again and again, as if to be sure it was real. The nurse clutched the towel to her chest and did not let go. Comfort had never been safe before. It had been weakness, a trap. But now, wrapped in warmth, they began to wonder. What if softness wasn't surrender? What if it was survival? The question lingered long after their hair had dried, after the steam had faded, after the guards closed the door to the shower house for the night. It followed them into their dreams, the possibility that kindness might not be a weapon. And then, one morning, another shock arrived, quieter than all the rest. The guards came carrying boxes. Inside were pencils, sheets of paper, envelopes. They laid them neatly on the long tables in the mess hall and said, through an interpreter, that the women could write home, letters, real ones. The words seemed impossible, even absurd. The women exchanged glances, skeptical, frozen, as if the announcement were a riddle designed to expose their naivety. No one moved. Right? To whom? To mothers who had been told they were dead? To commanders who would call them disgraced? To families who would not even dare to read such letters aloud? For a long while, no one touched the paper. The trauma of silence had settled deep into them. For months, no, for years, their words had belonged to the Empire. They had repeated the same slogans, the same chants, the same orders. Their voices had been tools of obedience, not expression. And when they surrendered, even that was stripped away. Captivity had made them invisible, erased from the homeland they'd once served. To speak again felt dangerous. To write was almost an act of betrayal. The interpreter repeated the offer. "You can write to your families," he said gently. "Tell them you are safe. Tell them you are treated well." One woman laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "They won't believe us," she said in Japanese. "They'll think we've been turned into propaganda." But one of the guards, a young man with sunburned cheeks, didn't seem to understand her words. He only smiled shyly and set down an extra stack of paper. Then he walked away. Hours passed before the first hand reached for a pencil. It was the nurse, the same woman who had cried in the showers. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the tip to the page. For a moment she could not write. She simply stared at the whiteness of the paper, so clean it hurt her eyes. It reminded her of the hospital linens she used to fold, of purity, of beginnings. Then, slowly, she began to form the first words. "Mother, I am alive. They feed us warm food. I do not understand any of this." The graphite left faint gray marks, fragile as breath. But once she saw the sentence appear, the air inside her lungs changed. She exhaled, fully, deeply, for the first time since the war began. Around her, the sound of pencils scratching filled the room like rain after drought. Some women wrote quickly, pouring years of silence into sentences that spilled off the page. Others wrote cautiously, weighing every word. A few couldn't bring themselves to start at all. They simply folded the blank paper into their pockets, as if the permission itself were enough to hold. That night, the letters were collected. The guards sealed them, stamped them, and carried them away. None of the women truly believed they would be sent, but the act of writing had already changed them. For the first time, they had spoken for themselves, not for their empire, not for a superior officer, but for their own survival. Weeks later, in Tokyo, military intelligence officers intercepted those same letters. They read the words in disbelief, reports of kindness, of food, of warmth. They read that their prisoners were being treated with dignity. And they did not know what to do with that truth, because in a world built on loyalty and silence, even a single letter could sound like treason. But treason, it turned out, had a smell, warm, golden, buttery, the kind that drifted in before roll call, curling beneath the cracks in the barrack doors and settling in their noses before their eyes had even opened. Cornbread had returned, not as a gesture, not as a surprise, but as a regular presence. It came every few mornings now, baked fresh in the kitchen by a boy from Oklahoma who looked more like a farmhand than a soldier. Private Thomas, they had heard someone call him. He had a crooked smile and a scar on his chin that he claimed came from a horse, not a bullet. He didn't speak much Japanese, but he always said "good morning" when they passed him, like they were neighbors instead of prisoners. He wore his apron like armor and wielded his spatula with the seriousness of a man who believed breakfast could end wars. The women didn't know what to make of it at first, the frequency, the intention, the smell. One even whispered, "They're softening us." But the suspicion had lost its edge, because when the trays were set down, steam rising, butter glistening, it wasn't just food anymore. It was a memory that hadn't belonged to them, a tradition foreign and strange, offered freely without strings. One afternoon a guard beckoned two of them into the kitchen. They hesitated, unsure if it was punishment, but instead of scolding, they found Private Thomas standing by the counter, holding out a bowl. "Flour," he said, tapping it. "You mix." He pointed to his own hands, then to theirs. Slowly, one of the women stepped forward, then the other. They dipped their hands into the soft powder, unsure, watching his movements like decoding an unfamiliar language. He showed them the cornmeal next, sugar, eggs. He mimed cracking them, whisking them, pouring milk. The women mimicked him with slow, deliberate care. Their hands shook at first, not from fear, but from something deeper. Hesitation, vulnerability. But then the rhythm took over, stirring, folding, kneading. The ingredients came together under their palms, warm and sticky and alive. Private Thomas gestured toward the oven, then tapped his wrist like a clock. "We wait." He leaned against the counter and said something else, too fast for them to catch, but the tone was gentle, easy. Not authority, not threat, just a man watching bread rise. The women stood side by side, still in disbelief. One nudged the other with her elbow, and for the first time since their arrival, a laugh escaped. Small, tentative, but real. It startled even them. She clapped a hand to her mouth, eyes wide, not because of punishment, but because joy had felt dangerous for so long. But then the other laughed too, and the sound caught like fire. They leaned against the counter, giggling now, softly, the way girls might after curfew back home. Not prisoners, not soldiers, just women in a kitchen, baking. When the cornbread was ready, Private Thomas handed them the first slices. He didn't eat, just watched them bite into it, nodding when they looked at him. "Good?" he asked. They both nodded back, eyes wet. That night, back in the barracks, the nurse told the others what had happened. Not in detail, just enough. "We made it ourselves," she said, cradling a piece in cloth as if it were sacred. Someone asked what it tasted like. She answered quietly, "Like something new." In that kitchen, between flour and laughter, something had shifted again. The cornbread was no longer just nourishment, it was a crack in the wall, a glimpse of a world where identity wasn't defined by uniforms or flags, but by shared bread and burned fingers and flour on your nose. And for the first time, the enemy hadn't just given them something. He had let them make it too. The warmth of that kitchen still clung to their sleeves when the world shattered. Again. The announcement came not with ceremony, but through a single sheet of paper posted to the mess hall wall, typed, translated, pinned by a thumbtack. Most of the women couldn't read English, but they recognized one name, Hiroshima. A murmur spread across the barracks. The interpreter arrived minutes later, his voice subdued, face pale. He explained slowly, carefully. Hiroshima had been destroyed, a single bomb. Then Nagasaki, another. The war was over. The emperor had surrendered. The women gathered beneath the cottonwood tree at the far edge of the camp. It was where they sometimes went to be alone, where the breeze moved softly through the branches, and for a few moments it was easy to pretend they weren't prisoners. That day, they sat together on the dry ground, not speaking, just staring at the dirt, the sky, each other. The silence was not shock. It was mourning. But it wasn't the loss of victory they grieved. It was the collapse of meaning. One woman, the same who had once warned that kindness was a trap, bent forward until her forehead touched the earth. Her breath came in sharp bursts. She didn't cry for her homeland. She cried because she no longer knew what it was. They had been promised glory, death with honor, a home that would revere them for their sacrifice, but their home had vanished. Their cities were ash, their names forgotten, and the enemies who were supposed to destroy them had given them cornbread, warm showers, soap, and pencils. A young nurse broke down quietly under the tree. She clutched her knees to her chest and shook with grief, not from defeat, but from confusion. How could the men who offered her a second serving of stew be the ones her commanders had said would brutalize her? How could the cowboys, who tipped their hats, who sang soft tunes as they swept the steps, exist in the same war where her brother had died screaming in a jungle? No one had answers, only questions. Their world had been built on absolutes, empire or nothing, death or dishonor. Now dishonor had a gentle face, a human one. Letters stopped arriving, not because of the Americans, but because there were no longer homes to receive them. The women asked fewer questions about repatriation. They no longer looked to the fences and wondered when they would leave. For many, the idea of return now felt as unbearable as captivity once had. One woman looked at the cottonwood tree and whispered, "It's strange to feel safest behind barbed wire." Another nodded, not because it made sense, but because it no longer had to. Later that day, the mess hall served cornbread again. No one joked, no one wept. They just ate slowly, quietly, absorbing its warmth like a balm. It was the unbearable irony of gentleness in defeat that when their homeland fell, it was not into cruelty, but into comfort, not into rage, but into unfamiliar mercy. And perhaps the most disorienting truth of all was this: the enemy had given them more humanity than the cause they had once served. It was a victory that tasted like butter, and it would haunt them longer than any bomb ever could. The announcement came without fanfare, just a clipboard, a list of names, and a nod from a guard who looked as uncomfortable as the women felt. They were going home. But no one moved, no one cheered. The word home had become unfamiliar, hollow, like a room they could no longer enter. They were issued bundles, not weapons or uniforms this time, but clothes folded carefully, a blouse, a skirt, a jacket not quite new but clean. Inside each bundle were small, strange tokens, things the guards said they could take with them. One woman found a comb wrapped in cloth, another a pressed handkerchief. The nurse received a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, a recipe for cornbread, handwritten in crooked letters. They stood in line at the gates, the same gates that had once promised humiliation. Now they promised uncertainty. The cowboy who had first handed them food stood by the fence. He didn't say a word, just lifted his hat slightly, the same way he always had. Not mockery, not pity, just something that felt like respect. Then he turned away. They boarded the transport quietly, carrying everything they had, and much more they couldn't name. The journey was long, the sea wide and gray. The ship smelled of salt, diesel, and sweat. They were fed, just as before. But this time the meals were eaten in silence. No soft laughter, no surprise, only the sound of waves and metal and memory. On the third night, one woman sat alone by the porthole, her fingers curled around a pencil and the notebook she had kept hidden since her first letter. She opened to the last page and wrote slowly, pressing each word into the paper like a wound. They treated me as if I mattered. I don't know what to do with that. She stared at the sentence for a long time, then closed the book. When they reached Japan, the women stepped onto docks that didn't feel like land. The ports were hushed, battered, thick with the smell of ash and decay. Cities that had once been lit with lanterns were now shadows. Homes were gone, families shattered. No one welcomed them. There were no banners, no embraces, only silence. The nurse's mother met her at a checkpoint. She had aged beyond recognition, cheeks sunken, hair gray with grief. She did not speak at first, just stared at her daughter's shoes, clean, polished, American. Later, in what was left of their home, a shed patched with tarp and prayer, her mother finally asked the question that had been waiting in her eyes. "Did they hurt you?" The nurse paused, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. "They fed me. They helped me." Her mother looked away. She didn't nod. She didn't cry. But her hand, when it reached across the table, trembled. The shame the women carried was not for what they had done, but for what had been done to them. The kindness they had been shown. They could not explain it, not to families who had starved, not to neighbors who had buried children. How could they describe warm beds, fresh cornbread, the weight of a blanket tucked in by someone who was supposed to be the enemy? They did not speak of it often, but some wrote, quietly. One woman kept the cornbread recipe hidden beneath the floorboards. Another placed her folded towel in a drawer, never used. They were not souvenirs. They were evidence, not of war, but of contradiction. And in that contradiction, they lived. Survivors, not heroes. Witnesses to a kindness they had never been trained to understand. Years later, in a small apartment in post-war Tokyo, one of those women stood in her kitchen. The city outside hummed again, the rattle of streetcars, the faint music from a cafe, the laughter of children who had never seen a battlefield. She had rebuilt her life, brick by brick, meal by meal. Yet some mornings, when the light came in just so through the thin curtain, she could still smell the past. Diesel oil, gunmetal, and, impossibly, butter. She opened a tin from the back of a cupboard. Inside was a small measure of cornmeal, yellow as dusted gold, wrapped in paper that had faded but survived. She had hidden it for nearly a decade, beneath floorboards and behind rice jars, as though it were contraband. Her fingers trembled slightly as she poured it into a bowl. She added milk, sugar, an egg, stirring slowly until the batter thickened. Her movements were deliberate, ritualistic, like a prayer performed from memory. When she lit the small gas stove, the flame caught with a quiet hiss. The scent rose, soft, sweet, unmistakable. She froze, eyes closing. It was the same scent that had drifted through the camp kitchen years ago, mingling with the laughter of enemies who had forgotten, for a moment, that they were supposed to hate. Her daughter, barely 10, peeked into the kitchen doorway. "Mama," she asked, "what is that?" The woman smiled faintly, not at the child, but at the memory. "Something from another life," she said. She didn't explain. How could she? How could she tell a child born into peace that the enemy had once taught her the meaning of gentleness, that cornbread, not propaganda, had dismantled her certainties? As the bread baked, the air filled with warmth that did not belong to this apartment, a warmth carried from another world, across an ocean, through barbed wire and disbelief. She sat by the stove, hands folded in her lap, listening to the soft crackle of the crust forming. And for the first time in years, she let herself remember it all without shame. Cornbread had become more than food. It was memory, proof, and confession all at once. The taste had lived longer than the war, longer than the fear. It had turned into something her heart understood even when her words could not. that survival was not only about enduring cruelty, but also about accepting unexpected kindness. When the timer rang, she removed the pan carefully and set it on the counter. The surface glowed golden in the dim light. Her daughter reached for a piece, and she nodded. The girl took a bite, her face lighting up with surprise. "It's sweet," she said. Her mother only nodded again. "Yes," she whispered, "it is." The moment passed quietly, but its echo would live on. The girl would remember that scent years later, not the smell of destruction, but of something healed. Compassion passed down not through speeches or ceremonies, but through taste. The war had ended, but its most dangerous weapon, dignity, still lingered. Not the kind built by flags or orders, but the kind awakened in the unlikeliest of places. In soap, in music, in cornbread baked by the hands of men once called enemies. The woman sat down beside her daughter and let the sweetness settle on her tongue. It was more than flavor, it was truth, quiet, inconvenient, enduring, the kind of truth no regime could erase. If you've made it to this moment, to the scent of cornbread and the silence of a changed heart, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this story from. Scroll down just below the video, tap that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell so we can keep bringing forgotten stories like this one to life. Your support lets us keep exploring the paradoxes of war, dignity, and what it means to be human, one story at a time.